and welcome to our next episode of the Hormone Café. Today, we're going to be talking about the thyroid. The thyroid is very important in our general hormone production, and most of all, we think of it as our part of our metabolism. So when we're making thyroid hormone, we're helping all of our metabolic processes in our body. So when we're looking at our hormone production and we're looking at our cycles, one thing that we really always want to check is our thyroid. Because if our thyroid is off, either whether it's low or high, it can cause, if it's not functioning well and your thyroid is low, it can cause things like fatigue, sensitivity to cold, like you're just feeling cold all the time. And it can cause you to have brain fog, or if your thyroid is too high, it can make you feel really amped all the time, and like your metabolism is really, really high, and that can cause things like shooting your blood sugar low and things like that. So when, especially people who have irregular cycles, or they're having low or high hormone production, you always want to check your thyroid. So we do a comprehensive thyroid profile. And you really want to have excellent thyroid health so that you can support your metabolism, all the functions of your body, your brain health, prevent brain fog, and be making hormones as optimally as we possibly can. So things that we check here, for example, are something called TSH. So TSH is a hormone that talks to our pituitary gland and tells our gland to make more thyroid hormone, and that thyroid hormone is T4 and T3. So we think of TSH kind of as an opposite number, meaning if your TSH is high, that means your actual thyroid hormone is low and your thyroid is a bit sluggish. Also, sometimes just because the lab tells you that your values are normal, in our fertility world and our women's health world, we have much stricter guidelines. So for example, sometimes in LabCorp, they'll let your TSH go higher than 4.5 before it will flag it as abnormal. But when we're looking at it, we really want our TSH to be between 0.5 and 2.5. So not too high, not too low. So we really want to check your TSH and make sure that it's less than 2.5 and that it's higher than 0.5. Something that's helpful too is that your thyroid is extremely variable. Literally, it's part of your metabolism. So if you're doing something that has a lot of metabolic needs, like you're really working out or you're super duper stressed, sometimes that can make your thyroid a little bit sluggish. So when we check your thyroid, you want to check it a couple different times just to make sure, for example, if we think your thyroid is low or you're hypothyroid, then we want to make sure that it truly is low time after time, and then it wasn't just a one-time thing. So when you get your thyroid labs drawn, if something is off, the first thing you want to do is just repeat it just to make sure you get a trend over time before we start treating it or look into certain treatments. So TSH is something that we check. Then we also check your T4, which is one of your thyroid hormones, and then we check your T3, and then you want to check free and total T3, and then depending on your situation, sometimes we'll check what's called your reverse T3. Reverse T3 can be really high if we are really, really stressed, or if our body's going through some kind of physiologic or psychological difficulties, whether that's physical stress or stress that's going on in our life. So it kind of gives us a sense of if our body is diverting a lot of our hormone into something that we call reverse T3, then we really want to bring those reverse T3 levels down. The other thing that's really, really important to check is your thyroid antibodies. And you want to check both of your thyroid antibodies. So we have something called TPO, thyroid peroxidase antibodies, and we have something called TGA, thyroglobulin antibodies. So when you're thinking about a full thyroid profile, you want to be checking at least TSH, T4, T3, and your thyroid antibodies. Sometimes when you go to the doctor, all they'll do is check your TSH, but it really does not give you the whole picture of your thyroid. Because if your thyroid antibodies are high, it means that you have autoimmune thyroid disease. So you either have Graves' disease, where your thyroid's overworking, or you have Hashimoto's, where your thyroid can be underworking, but sometimes you can have a perfectly normal TSH and a perfectly normal T4, but you have positive thyroid antibodies. That means that you have an autoimmune disease. It means that your body has antibodies that are attacking your thyroid. If we don't work to bring those antibodies down, then it can cause us to have thyroid dysfunction over time that we never caught and we never knew anything about. Also, people who have Hashimoto's, they do have a higher chance of having miscarriages. So we really want to make sure that we're optimizing your levels and bringing your thyroid antibodies down as much as we possibly can. So when we think about our thyroid, the labs that we're checking is TSH, T4, T3, and a full thyroid antibody panel. That means a TPO and a TGA. And then we want your TSH to be between 0.5 and 2.5, and we want to check it multiple times just to make sure we're being accurate. So the most common thing that I see is hypothyroidism, meaning your TSH is high. And then what we call subclinical hypothyroidism means that your TSH is high, but your T4 is normal. So sometimes your TSH will go high, but your body is actually making enough thyroid hormone. So in that circumstance, we think about, okay, what do we do to balance out our thyroid? Number one, everything that we always do starts with nutrition. And it's really helpful to measure some of those underlying causes. For example, we always want to check your iodine, your selenium, your zinc, your magnesium, and your vitamin D. Because if you're low in any of those actual building blocks of thyroid hormone, so for example, your thyroid needs a certain amount of iodine in order to make thyroid hormone properly. So if you're low in any of those, for example, if you're low in magnesium or you're low in vitamin D, then we can supplement those or get those through your nutrition and then make sure that your body has enough building blocks to actually make thyroid hormone, recheck it, make sure we're on track, and then recheck your thyroid. So sometimes it's just a matter of giving you the elements that your body needs in order to make thyroid hormone. And then we can supplement zinc, magnesium, iodine, and selenium to support your thyroid as much as possible. So we look at your nutrition, we look at your elements and your vitamins and make sure that you're having enough to support your thyroid function. If that isn't cutting it, then we talk about, okay, should we start you on thyroid medication? The most common thing that we start you on is something called levothyroxine. That's the body's equivalent of T4 on a blood draw, because it is true that if we can get your thyroid under control, it does improve your chances of fertility, for example, and improves our body's ability to make hormones properly and regulate our cycles. So if we've done all the other things and your thyroid's still a bit sluggish, then we can start you on thyroid hormone. Levothyroxine can be really tricky. For example, if you're taking levothyroxine or thyroid hormone, you want to take it first thing in the morning on an empty stomach, fasted, and then you can't eat or drink anything within 30 minutes. So sometimes when we start thyroid hormone, we really have to rearrange our morning routines, because if you're a person who eats right away in the morning or drinks a bunch of water right away or has your coffee right away in the morning, then we have to adjust our routine so that our thyroid medication is absorbing properly. Thyroid medication is also extremely sensitive. There are very different fillers that different pharmacies and pharmaceutical companies use when they make levothyroxine. And so sometimes people can be really sensitive to those fillers, or it just doesn't work for them. For example, sometimes we'll start somebody on thyroid medication and their TSH won't come down. And so we think, okay, what's going on? Are they just not responding to the medication well? Is it the wrong filler? Are we not absorbing things properly? So it's really important, because of course we want to use the lowest dose of thyroid medication needed in order to get your thyroid optimal. And so sometimes we actually have to enforce that we need the brand name. So we need Pederson or we need Synthroid in order to make sure that you really are getting the proper amount of T4 or thyroid hormone and that the filler agrees with your body. So sometimes the first thing that we'll do is we'll actually change the brand before we change the dose. Or if we change the dose and it still isn't working, then we need to change the brand outside of generic levothyroxine. So thyroid hormone can be really, really sensitive. A lot of times people don't want to start on thyroid hormone because they don't want to be just committed to being on thyroid hormone forever, which is completely understandable. I totally agree. Usually though, when we get your other hormones straightened out, so for example, if we can get your blood sugar straightened out, your prolactin straightened out, your estrogen and progesterone, oftentimes that will naturally help straighten out your thyroid too. And eventually we can come off of that thyroid hormone. So it really depends on your situation. Sometimes we try to work on things naturally, try all the other things first, optimize your thyroid, and then maybe you never need to go on thyroid hormone. Sometimes you need to go on thyroid hormone for brief periods of time while we're working on all the other things. And then eventually we can wean off thyroid hormone, but it gets your endocrine system in line as quickly as possible so we can get you ovulating well and get your hormones balanced as quickly as possible. So that's hypothyroidism, when your thyroid is underworking. And then there's something called hyperthyroidism, when your thyroid is overworking. So that is when your TSH is low and either your T4 is normal, which is called subclinical hyperthyroidism, or your T4 is high, and that's what we consider hyperthyroidism. So something is going on where your body is reacting a lot and making a ton of thyroid hormone. So things that we want to check in that circumstance, for example, is of course you want to check your thyroid antibodies, because if you have thyroid antibodies and you have Graves' disease, it can give you a lot of T4 and cause hyperthyroidism. So then we need to be on medication to bring your thyroid hormone down. And those medications, we try to use them also for short times. We try to bring your hormone in line as much as possible and then eventually come off those medications. But one thing that you want to do is we always want to do a thyroid ultrasound, because you want to make sure that you don't have any thyroid nodules. So I had a patient, for example, who was having really irregular cycles. She had been to a bunch of other doctors. No one could figure out what was going on. I did a full thyroid panel. It turned out that she had hyperthyroid. So her thyroid was really, really functioning high. It wasn't making sense. Her hormones were really high. I had her go get a thyroid ultrasound, and it turned out not only did she have thyroid nodules, but she actually had thyroid cancer. So she had to go to a surgeon, get her thyroid removed, make sure her cancer was under control. And then we had to start her on thyroid hormone, because when you have no thyroid, you have to be started on thyroid hormone. But once she got her cancer removed and we started her on proper amounts of thyroid hormone, she was pregnant in 2 months. And she said, "Oh my gosh, I had no idea. I can't believe anybody never checked my thyroid when they were just focusing on my irregular cycles and my estrogen and my other hormones." So it is really important to always check thyroid as part of a comprehensive hormone check and do a comprehensive thyroid hormone profile. So hypothyroidism is when your thyroid is underworking. Hyperthyroidism is when your thyroid is overworking. So we want to do an ultrasound, check for thyroid nodules, see if we have to be on medication for hyperthyroidism to help calm our thyroid down so it's not overproducing hormones. And then the other things that we really want to pay attention to is I really often see Hashimoto's disease, where people have positive TPO or TPA antibodies. Hashimoto's is an autoimmune disease, which means your body is attacking your thyroid hormone. And eventually over time, if your body's attacking your thyroid, if your body's attacking your thyroid, it can cause a lot of thyroid dysfunction, and having those inflammatory antibodies in your system can affect your fertility. So we really want to I try to shoot, for example, for your TPO antibodies to be less than 100. Sometimes they're really low and your Hashimoto's isn't that bad, or they're really, really high. I mean, I've seen TPO antibodies in the 600s, 800s, 900s before. So with all autoimmune diseases, there is a genetic component to that, meaning sometimes we pass on autoimmune diseases, and despite everything that we do, we'll hit a wall past which we cannot bring your antibodies down. However, the lower we can get your antibodies, the more likely it is we can regulate your hormones, make you feel great, help you get pregnant more easily. So our goal really is to bring those thyroid antibodies down. So what options do we have to bring antibodies down is, number one, of course, everything we do starts with nutrition. So we really want to be on an anti-inflammatory diet, and we want to be doing things to support our natural thyroid. So when we think about selenium, our biggest source of selenium is going to be Brazil nuts. So we want to be doing Brazil nuts and a variety of nuts. And then when we think about iodine, our biggest sources of iodine are going to be things like seaweed, kelp, iodinized salt. So those are things that we can be eating to help support our thyroid production. And then we want to be doing magnesium. So magnesium foods are going to be things like grains and buckwheat and our leafy greens and our seeds and nuts. So we want to be doing a diverse variety of that, also to support our thyroid. So just nutrition alone can help support our thyroid. And then we want to be very, very anti-inflammatory, because Hashimoto's is an inflammatory condition. So we do not want to do anything to fuel our body's inflammation. So that means we want to be really, really low sugar. We do not want to be introducing sugar every single day into our lives. We want to keep sugar rare and as a treat. So we only want to be doing natural sugars, like the sugars that are found in fruits. We don't want to be adding things like honey and maple syrup to our diet every single day. We don't want to be doing like treats, desserts, baked goods every single day. We want to keep that rare. Another thing that we want to make sure is that we're not eating other inflammatory foods, which most commonly is in refined and processed carbohydrates. So when we're doing things like bread and rice and pasta, we want it to be long grain, whole grain, brown, lots of seeds, crunchy, not things that are really homogeneous and uniform and white. So if it's really uniform and homogeneous and white, we want to convert that over to something. For example, we don't want to be doing white rice. We want to be doing wild rice. We don't want to be doing white bread. We want to be doing some kind of a seed bread, that kind of a thing. So that literally can help us decrease our inflammation. So we want to be eating enough nutrients to optimize our thyroid, and then we want to be eating an anti-inflammatory diet to really bring any thyroid antibodies down that are high. Sometimes people will recommend that if you have Hashimoto's, that you go gluten and dairy free. Sometimes I get worried about this because when people go gluten-free, they tend to eat a lot of gluten-free processed food or a lot of gluten-free flour that actually can be pro-inflammatory. So when you look at a lot of gluten-free things, you're just eating a lot of rice, tapioca, almond. Those things are actually really inflammatory and they do spike your blood sugar. So if your antibodies are really, really high, sometimes it's worth doing a trial of gluten and dairy free, and then we repeat your antibodies and we see if they're coming down, because in some people, gluten and dairy, they can be inflammatory. So sometimes we'll do a gluten and dairy free trial to see if it brings your antibodies down. But we have to be really, really careful, because if we're gluten free, we need to be doing high quality gluten free grains. So we need to be doing millet and einkorn and buckwheat. We can't just be doing almond flour, because that has no nutritional value and it's actually very pro-inflammatory to do that. And then with dairy, if we're going to be dairy free, we also have to be careful, because we want to make sure we're getting enough protein, fat, and calcium in our diet if we're not doing dairy. So if we have Hashimoto's, it's not universally recommended that we go gluten or dairy free. However, if your antibodies are really, really high, it can be an option, but we need to be measuring it. Sometimes I had a patient, for example, who had antibodies in the 600s. I had her do gluten and dairy free for 3 months. We repeated her antibodies and they were still in the 600, which means that diet didn't help her. So then I do not want her to be gluten dairy free for no reason, right? If you're doing something, it's not making a change, then we need to be doing something else. So what are our other options other than nutrition? So we talked about nutrition and supplements to promote Hashimoto's. And then the other things that we think about, going on thyroid medication can help bring your antibodies down. So that can be an option if we want to start levothyroxine. And then we think about other anti-inflammatory things. So for example, our supplements that are anti-inflammatory, quercetin and turmeric, for example. And then when we think about our prescriptions, we think about things like low-dose prednisone and doing low-dose steroids to help bring down our inflammation, or doing something called low-dose naltrexone, which is another anti-inflammatory. So we can do, obviously, nutrition and then supplements and sometimes prescriptions to bring that inflammation from our Hashimoto's down as much as possible. And then we want to measure antibodies, because we always want to make sure they're as low as we can possibly get them. And sometimes things in our life just get a little bit crazy, right? We change jobs, we're super stressed, we're traveling. That can really flare our antibodies. So we want to know what brings us into an antibody flare or a Hashimoto's flare, and how do we get that back as quickly as possible. And in the perfect world, we want to think of it long term as, how do we prevent having those antibody flares, right? How do we make sure that we're eating properly, no matter what kind of curveballs are thrown in our life, and that we're managing our stress, no matter what curveballs are thrown to us, so we can continuously manage our antibodies and get them as low as possible without ping-ponging back and forth between high antibodies and low antibodies, and then having to go back and get them lower and straighten them out again. So the whole goal with Hashimoto's, because it is a long-term life disease. However, sometimes we can bring it completely in remission. If we're eating a really pro-thyroid diet and we're being really anti-inflammatory, we're taking our supplements, sometimes we can get it down where you literally have no antibodies at all, and I would never have known that you have Hashimoto's. So it is possible to get Hashimoto's in remission. And then you just want to check on your thyroid, usually every 3 to 6 months, just depending on how volatile it is, and make sure that you're keeping it in the ranges that we want it to be kept in. So that's my approach to things like Hashimoto's. Those are the type of thyroid numbers that we check. I would say sometimes we think we supplement with T4, and then some people come to me and they're actually taking T3, or they're taking something like NP thyroid, where they have a combination of T4 and T3. However, usually in a fertility world, when we're trying to get pregnant, I recommend that we don't be on T3 unless we absolutely need it, because T4 does cross the placenta, but T3 does not cross the placenta. And so we don't want the baby to be seeing less hormone than the mom is seeing, because that will change the baby's TSH production. And so we really won't, if we're pregnant or we're trying to get pregnant, we really only want to try to be on T4. We don't want to be on T3. However, there are some people who their T3 is really low and they might need a little bit of T3 to feel amazing. However, we want to think about, because T3 literally comes from T4. So instead of just taking T3, which can sometimes be a band-aid because it does make us feel better, but we really want to focus on the conversion of T4 to T3, right? Like if our T3 is low, instead of supplementing it, let's focus on our T4 and make sure we're converting T4 over into T3. So are we so stressed that it's not getting converted over well, or are we not getting enough nourishment? Where are those conversion pathways breaking down, and how do we work on the flow of T4 to T3 instead of just using T3? And then when we're in more of that perimenopausal or menopausal transition, we're not in our childbearing years anymore, fertility is not our goal, sometimes that's an appropriate time where it's a little bit healthier to use T3 and T4 and put those ratios together. So you just have to be really careful with thyroid hormone, right? You don't want to use medication as a band-aid to cover up something that we really want to be working on. However, if your thyroid is really slow or really sluggish, it can be helpful to use thyroid hormone to really improve your metabolism and improve the rest of your endocrine system and your hormone production. And then if we have autoimmune thyroid disease, supplements and medications can be really helpful, but we want to be always using the lowest doses necessary to meet our goals. And then you have to think of thyroid disease especially Hashimoto's, as a long-term thing, right? It's not something that we just fix really, really fast. It's something that you have to have a mindset shift into, okay, this is something that I'm going to have my whole life. How am I going to manage it long-term? How am I going to prevent these flares of my antibodies from happening, and how am I going to keep my thyroid healthy day in and day out? So your thyroid is super, super important. I always recommend doing a complete thyroid panel, especially multiple times, because it will give you a better picture about what's going on with your thyroid. And if anything is off, we want to reevaluate your nutrition, your supplements, sometimes do a thyroid ultrasound if necessary, look at your whole endocrine system, making sure there's nothing else that's going to affect your thyroid. And then if we're doing an intervention, you want to make sure it's actually working. You want to make sure that what you're doing is working, because if not, then we need to go back to the drawing board, recheck your thyroid, retest, and make sure that we're back to where we want to be, and that you feel like you have good energy and you have good thermoregulation. You're not getting too hot or too cold. You're getting fantastic sleep. You have a good metabolism. Those are the benefits of having a healthy thyroid. Thank you so much for joining us on this episode of the Hormone Cafe, and we'll see you soon.